Good evening. Tonight, we're following the worn boots and soaked cloaks of messengers in the Middle Ages. They moved through rain, hunger, and silence, always carrying someone else's words, never their own. Life as a medieval messenger was long stretches of mud, suspicion, and cold stone thresholds that never stayed open long. Maybe quiet stories like this help you breathe a little easier? If they do, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if that quiet feels welcome tonight. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's a quiet comfort knowing we're all here, even from far apart. Now, lower the lights, settle in, and we'll ease our way back, slowly, into the medieval road. The road had no shape anymore. What was once a narrow, uneven path between villages had dissolved into sludge, a sucking, grumbling stretch of ground that pulled at every step like a reluctant animal. The water wasn't clear, or even cold. It was warm in places, the kind of warmth that came from rot beneath the surface, from manure, from things that had died weeks ago and hadn't been cleared. The messenger kept moving forward, one foot bracing the other, his cloak heavy enough to drag against the mud. Rain slid down from the edge of his hood, dripping past his nose, into his beard, pooling at the base of his neck. His feet hadn't been dry since yesterday morning, and his boots, stiff to begin with, now rubbed and burned at the heels. Each mile took more time than the one before. But there were no excuses. The message had to be delivered before nightfall. The letter bore a crest that could not be late, even if the man carrying it was already fading into fever. At one point, he stopped beneath the dripping edge of a bare-limbed tree, more out of dizziness than choice. He leaned against the trunk, heart pounding in the hollow behind his sternum, and tried not to close his eyes. Rest meant stopping. Stopping meant sinking. Into the mud. Into sleep. Into consequences. He touched the pouch at his side where the letter was sealed. The wax was still intact. That was something. But the leather around it was softening from the rain, and if he didn't find a fire soon, the ink might run. He had seen that happen once, to another man who'd tried to warm a soaked message beside a hearth. The parchment had shriveled, and the ink had bloomed outward like veins. The punishment had been swift. Nobody asked whether the storm was bad. They only asked why the message was unreadable. The weather wasn't the worst part, and it never had been. It was the silence from doorways when he passed, the way villagers glanced without meeting his eye, the muttering behind shutters. Messengers weren't trusted, even when they wore official colors, sometimes especially when they wore official colors. People assumed they carried orders for new taxes, or conscription lists, or news of someone's execution. The rain only made it worse. Wet men with cloaks drawn tight were harder to read. He once heard of a boy stoned outside a hamlet after arriving in a storm. They said he was a scout for bandits. The truth didn't matter. Only the fear did. So the messenger walked past the huts without slowing, eyes down, legs aching, hunger curling beneath his ribs like something alive. He had bread in his pack, but it was wet now. A cold, doughy sponge that wouldn't go down unless he tore it with his teeth and swallowed quickly. The path ahead sloped down into a shallow stream that wasn't there last week. Rain had turned it from a trickle into a span wide enough to steal a man's boot if he stepped carelessly. He gritted his teeth and walked in anyway, water surging past his knees, pulling at the hem of his tunic. Stones shifted underfoot, sharp and uncertain. With each step, he thought of the ink, the edges of the parchment, and imagined the words bleeding together like they did when he stared too long without blinking. He reached the other side with a gasp, shivering, water now clinging to his thighs. There were still hours to go, maybe more. The message weighed nothing, but it had the gravity of a verdict. And the rain? The rain was just the beginning. It blurred the world, made it soft and strange. But what waited at the end of the road was harder. colder, and far less forgiving. There were hoofprints in the mud ahead, deep, clean, orderly, pressed by an animal well-fed and recently shod. Somewhere on the road, a nobleman had passed, riding high and dry beneath a velvet-lined cloak, the horse doing the work that his legs never would. But no such luxury belonged to messengers. Horses were rationed like silver, counted, protected, and rarely trusted to the hands of someone who didn't have a title before their name. A messenger walked. He walked through cold, through pain, through the blistering sun and the thawing slush of early spring. Sometimes he carried 2 pairs of shoes, one to wear, one tied to his belt, to be swapped when the soles fell apart. Often even that was too much weight. So the shoes cracked, then split. Socks tore, skin bled, dried and peeled. Still, the road continued. Messages didn't wait for comfort. Walking meant distance wasn't measured in miles, but in what it did to the body. Each league was a calculation of pain. How many paces until the blister opened, how far until the next stream to wash the blood, how long before the hip locked and refused to move again. The pouches on his belt grew heavier, not because of their contents, but because of exhaustion. The strap across the shoulder chafed with every step, and by nightfall the skin beneath it was raw, darkened with sweat and salt. He passed by a mounted patrols and traders, all of them looking down, not with scorn, but indifference. A man on foot was nothing more than another figure in the landscape, too familiar to notice, too low to greet. Rest stops weren't real things. There was no schedule, no marked bench beneath a tree, no stable waiting with oats and water. A messenger stopped only when the legs refused to lift again. And even then, rest was short. A few minutes to stretch beneath a stone wall, maybe a heel of bread soaked in whatever water he had left, then back to his feet. Time was the enemy, not just the passing of it, but the uncertainty. No one ever said exactly when a message was expected. They only said, "Hurry." And so he did. He hurried through thorned thickets and wind-bitten clearings. He hurried when the ankles gave out, when the vision blurred, when the lips cracked so deeply they bled with every word he spoke. And through it all, he watched others ride. Horses carried news of war, yes, but only when the rider was a man of rank, a soldier on a mission, a steward of some house. Those with horses had the right to outrun the weather, to sleep dry, to arrive with their clothes intact and their bodies still upright. Messengers walked, and when they limped into a courtyard, soaked and silent, it was rarely with a welcome. More often, it was a glance from a servant, a nod to take the letter and nothing more. No fire, no bed, no thanks. Then they turned, tightened the straps again, and began the walk back. Because no matter how far the word traveled, the feet that carried it always returned alone. The message was sealed in dark green wax, pressed with a ring the messenger didn't recognize. He never asked what it said. He never tried to guess. Reading it would have been impossible anyway. Not just because most messengers were illiterate, but because the letters inside weren't meant to be understood. They were lines and symbols, sometimes numbers, written in a cramped hand that twisted language into something sharp and unreadable. Codes, ciphers, private tongues passed between nobles, between bishops, between people whose lives revolved around words others weren't allowed to hear. The man who carried the parchment didn't know what it contained, but he knew what it caused. He knew it could shift a boundary, start a feud, send someone to the gallows. And he knew that if someone stopped him on the road and saw that seal, it wouldn't matter that he couldn't read. He'd be held responsible for every letter anyway. There was a kind of fear that came not from danger but from implication, from being close enough to something powerful that it burned you, even if you never touched it. A messenger was just a body, a vessel, but the world didn't care. All it saw was the folded paper, the wax, the string, and that was enough to treat him like a threat. Guards searched his bag as if it were full of knives. Gatekeepers held him outside for hours while a scribe inspected his credentials. Priests made the sign of the cross behind his back, as if the words he carried might whisper blasphemy into their ears. And if someone powerful decided the letter should not have arrived, if it spoke of betrayal or war or unpaid debts, then the punishment often landed on the one who delivered it. The contents didn't need to be known. The presence alone was a sentence. He remembered one winter when a man he knew, another messenger, older, slower, had been caught with a letter bearing the wrong seal. No one ever said what the letter contained. But the town was tense that week. Rumors moved faster than horses. The old man was held for 2 days in a shed with no fire, then beaten in the square for being a conspirator. Not a word of the letter was read aloud. Not a single explanation was offered. They broke his left hand first, then they shaved his head and told him to walk home. He didn't make it. The road was too long, and his body too weak. The snow covered him sometime before dawn. The man carrying the current letter had passed that road only yesterday. The wind still moved the brush at the place where the old man had fallen, like the grass remembered how it felt to lie beneath him. It wasn't just nobles and soldiers who saw danger in the messages. Sometimes villagers did too. Once, in a small hamlet near the forest, a woman spotted a red ribbon tied around a scroll. She screamed, dropped her basket, and ran into her house. Others followed. He never learned what they thought it meant. Plague, tax, conscription. Something bad, certainly. By the time he reached the center of the village, no one would speak to him. He slept in the woods that night, hungry and damp, with the letter pressed close to his chest like a curse. The next morning, he moved on. The message had to reach a manor 2 valleys east. It was not his job to understand it. It was only his job to carry it, through fear, through silence, through a world that saw danger in the things he couldn't even read. The path began like any other, narrow, uneven, littered with stones that seemed to aim for the bones just beneath the skin. At first it was merely unpleasant, but by midday the ground turned hostile. Roots jutted out like broken ribs from the earth, slick with rain and half hidden under fallen leaves. Brambles crawled in from both sides, tearing at cloth and skin alike. Every step became a decision: to lift the foot higher and risk stumbling, or drag it forward and let the thorns do their work. The messengers' soles were already softening from damp and strain. The right heel throbbed with every shift of weight. The left toes had gone numb hours ago. Still he pressed on, teeth clenched, letter tight under his arm. Pain wasn't a warning anymore, just confirmation that the road was doing what roads always did, breaking him down. The next stretch offered no mercy. Mud replaced stones, and with it came suction, the kind that pulled boots halfway off before letting go with a cruel, wet sound. Twice he slipped and fell, palms driving into the filth. He didn't stop to check the scrapes. There was no point. The dirt would find them soon enough, and infection was as common a travel companion as hunger. Some parts of the road dipped low, filled with standing water that hid whatever lay beneath. Sharp sticks, shattered crockery, sometimes bones. Human bones. He'd stepped on them before. Brittle, light, wrong. No one bothered to bury bodies after a plague year. They were dragged to the side of the road or thrown into shallow ditches, sometimes covered, often not. Even now, he saw the outline of something collapsed in the reeds, bloated and greenish. He turned his eyes away and kept walking. Blood soaked through the fabric of his sock around mid-afternoon, warming briefly before cooling again into a wet sting. The friction between foot and leather was constant now, and the leather had hardened in strange places, curling inward like a second set of teeth. He shifted his gait to ease the pressure, but it only made the pain spread to the other side. Blisters opened, skin peeled. He thought once about taking the boots off and walking barefoot, just for a while, but he knew what the road would do to exposed flesh. There were places where the stones were jagged and narrow, pushed upward by time like cracked glass. In others, insects swarmed low to the ground, biting whatever they could find. And always there were thistles, dry ones, wet ones, red ones with barbed tips that clung to fabric and stayed there until pulled off, dragging threads behind them. Even when the road seemed clear, it betrayed him. A slope appeared gentle, then sent his knee twisting at the bottom. A dry patch turned slick with moss. Dust turned to paste with a sudden drizzle. There was no straight path, only detours. And each detour cost him something. Time, skin, strength, or the will to keep placing one foot in front of the other. The message never grew lighter. The satchel never sat easier. And the road? The road never forgave. It took in little increments with every hour. A toe lost to rot. A toenail peeled off in a boot. An ankle that stopped bending. He kept walking not because he had the strength, but because there was no one else to walk in his place. The road was not a thing he traveled. It was a thing that swallowed him. Slowly. Thoroughly. From the feet up. The forest at night was never silent. Even when the wind stilled and the trees stopped creaking, something always moved. Underbrush rustling with padded feet. Breath drawing slow in the darkness. The low crunch of something too heavy to be a hare. The messenger knew better than to light a fire. Smoke brought attention. Flames carried shadows. Better to sit in the blackness with his back to a tree, knife close, and ears open. Sleep, if it came shallow. The body never relaxed fully. One eye half-lidded. One hand always resting on the satchel where the message lay. Wolves didn't care what was inside. They weren't interested in wax seals or royal crests. They came for warmth, for salt, for blood. And if the messenger was alone, which he always was, he was no more than another tired animal among trees. The stories told in taverns made the wolves into monsters. Fangs like swords, glowing eyes, spirits of the damned. But the truth was quieter, crueler. They didn't roar or howl before striking. They watched first, waited, judged from a distance whether the man they saw could fight back or not. Sometimes he heard them breathing. Not close, just close enough. A huff, a crackle of leaves. The terrible pause afterward, where nothing moved, and the woods held their breath with him. He would sit for hours like that, muscles locked, hands frozen, body too afraid to tremble. And when morning finally came, when the grey light crept through the branches and showed no blood, no prints, no teeth, that was not relief. That was delay. The wolves didn't need to strike every time, just often enough that sleep became another danger. Some nights it was too cold to stop at all. Better to keep walking, even if the road was nothing but guesswork, even if the darkness pressed so hard against his face he couldn't tell open air from tree bark. Moving meant noise. Noise meant warning. He sang sometimes, not for comfort, but to announce that he was still alive, still upright. The sound came out rough, broken by dry lips and sore lungs. But it was something. Other times he dragged metal along stone, just enough to make a sound that might keep curious predators at a distance. But wolves were clever. They knew how to wait. They knew when the song stopped. They knew when the voice ran out and the footsteps slowed. That's when they came closer. That's when they watched without moving. By winter, frostbite joined the list of threats. Fingers lost feeling first, then toes. Then patches of skin along the cheeks and ears turned pale, then grey, then black. He remembered one delivery in the north, where the woods were thicker and the snow made everything muffled. He'd slept with his gloves inside his shirt to keep them warm, but still woke to a hand that wouldn't bend. The fingers were stiff, like wood. Later, he watched the tip of his left ring finger turn purple and split. There was nothing to be done. He wrapped it in cloth, tied it tight, and kept walking. The wolves smelled that too. The blood, the rot, the weakness. He saw their eyes that night, 4 of them, low to the ground and wide apart. They didn't attack. They didn't need to. The fear alone stripped more from him than teeth ever could. He delivered the letter late. No one asked why. No one ever did. The seal was everything. A single drop of colored wax, still warm when pressed by the signet ring, held more weight than the words beneath it. It wasn't just proof of authenticity. It was a symbol of power, of trust, of ownership. And if that seal arrived cracked, smeared, or disturbed in any way, then suspicion fell not on the parchment, nor on the sender, but on the one who carried it. Messengers lived in fear of that tiny circle. They checked it constantly, even as rain soaked through the pouch or heat made the wax soft again in the midday sun. Some wrapped it in wool, others layered it between sheets of dry bark, or tucked it deep inside a belt pouch lined with leather. But accidents happened. Horses stumbled, bags were crushed, and sometimes the seal simply crumbled of its own accord. Old wax, brittle and thin. No explanation ever mattered. If the seal was broken, the punishment was already decided. Every region had its own custom for dealing with tampered letters. Some demanded payment. Others, fingers. In noble courts, where paranoia grew thicker than ivy, messengers were hanged. Not interrogated, not imprisoned. Just hanged, publicly, briefly, without ceremony. They didn't care if he could read. They didn't ask if he'd looked. The logic was simple. If the seal broke, the message may have been compromised. If the message was compromised, someone had to pay. And the man who arrived holding it was the easiest one to reach. Some messengers tried to argue their way out. Most never got past a sentence. A few managed to flee before the verdict was passed, but flight only deepened the guilt in the eyes of those who judged. And worse, it stained the reputation of all who carried letters after. There was a story told among messengers, passed quietly between fires on the road. A boy once delivered a scroll with a partially smudged seal, not broken, but unclear. The steward who received it stared at the mark for several minutes before nodding. The boy was taken to the stables, told to wait, then found the next morning hanging by his belt from the rafters. The scroll itself was burned. No one ever learned what it said. The fear was that someone might have read it, not that someone had, and that fear was enough to end a life. Stories like that weren't rare. They were warnings. Every messenger knew at least one version of it, and everyone carried the same silent weight in their pack alongside the message. Not just parchment and wax, but guilt and danger, and the sure knowledge that their own survival depended on a substance softer than bone. Some took to wrapping the entire letter in cloth, stitched shut and bound with cord, not for protection but for deniability. If the recipient had to cut it open, then no one could accuse the messenger of doing it. But even that wasn't always safe. There were always those who wanted an excuse to punish, or distract, or make an example. And a letter with a blemished seal was the perfect target. In markets, in courtyards, in dark corners of manors, messengers found themselves cornered by questions they didn't know how to answer. Why is this mark smeared? Why does the wax look fresh? Why is the corner bent? Their mouths dried, their hands trembled. Even when innocent, the fear made them look guilty. And that, too, was enough. So they walked with care, every step measured, every pouch guarded like it held fire. Because in a way it did. And when fire turned against its bearer, it didn't ask for proof, only for silence. And a rope. The walls were visible by late afternoon, jagged shapes against the horizon, with wooden towers that caught the last gold of the sun. But the sun was already low, and the road still long. The messenger pushed forward, boots dragging through packed earth that had baked solid after a week of dry wind. His legs trembled from the day's march, but the thought of a fire, of bread, of a roof, kept him upright. Towns were supposed to be safe, places with gates and guards and laws, but only if you arrived on time. And time was measured by shadows, not by mercy. The gates would close when the light dipped behind the far ridge, no matter who approached. No matter what message they carried, no matter how far they had walked, it was nothing personal, just routine, just habit, just rules. He had been close once before, only a mile away, when the bells rang and the hinges groaned shut. He'd called out, waving the satchel, naming his sender and pointing to the seal. But the guards on the wall didn't come down. They didn't even answer. A man yelling at dusk was not worth the risk. Opening the gates after sundown meant letting danger in, disease, spies, beasts. So he spent that night outside the wall, behind a low ridge where the wind caught less. There was no fire. A fire would draw eyes. He had wrapped himself in his cloak and curled around the satchel like it was a child. Sleep came in bursts, shallow, breathless things. Wolves called out once. Something moved nearby, too heavy to be a fox. Morning came late, slow, aching. It wasn't just about safety. Some towns locked their gates as a show of order, a sign that they belonged to someone, a lord, a council, a guild. And those someones didn't like surprises. Letters were supposed to arrive at breakfast, not at twilight. A man knocking on wood after curfew looked like desperation. Or guilt. Even if the messenger had walked 3 days without pause, even if he bled through his boot, the gatekeeper didn't care. Come back at dawn, they would say. Camp by the tree line. And so he did. So they all did. Dozens of messengers across dozens of roads, curled in cloaks that stank of wet wool and fear, waiting for sunrises that promised nothing but another hour on their feet. Some didn't wait at all. They wandered at night, hoping to find a barn or a hollow where the wind wouldn't bite so hard. But darkness hid more than danger. It erased paths. It made trees lie. A wrong turn meant more than delay. It could mean ditch water, or a broken ankle, or a quiet end far from any wall. Those who stayed put at least had the comfort of direction. The town was there, just ahead, behind stone and torchlight. They could smell the smoke from kitchens, hear the low bark of dogs, feel the presence of other lives continuing just out of reach. That hurt more than hunger, more than cold. To be so close, to food, to shelter, to hands that might pass a cup of broth and still be locked out. It reminded them who they were, not guests, not travelers, just messengers, with no name that mattered, and a burden that didn't buy them a bed. The village was small, a bend in the road with smoke curling from 3 rooftops and chickens pecking in the mud. The messenger had been walking since before dawn, and his left foot had begun to swell against the seam of his boot. He needed water, a place to rest for an hour, maybe 2. But as soon as he crossed the threshold of the first gate post, all eyes turned toward him. Women stopped stirring pots. A man at the well tightened his grip on the rope. Children vanished without a sound. Strangers didn't pass through often, and when they did, they usually brought trouble. Conscription notices, grain demands, war taxes. Or worse, messages that no one could read but that everyone feared. His satchel, marked with a wax crest and tied with leather cord, looked too official, too heavy with meaning. The villagers didn't ask what he was carrying. They only asked who he was carrying it for. No answer ever satisfied them. If he named a noble, they wondered if he was here to spy on their loyalty. If he named a bishop, they feared accusations of heresy. If he said nothing, they assumed the worst. There was always a war somewhere, even if it wasn't near. And every war had scouts. Scouts had disguises and messengers. Well, they moved quickly, asked questions, remembered names. That was enough. They didn't see a tired man with cracked lips and a limp. They saw a threat, a spy in plain clothing, someone to report them, someone to mark their fences for raiders. The older ones squinted at him with milky eyes, murmuring words too low to catch. The younger ones held pitchforks like walking sticks. It didn't take much to shift from suspicion to action. A word, a gesture, a glance they didn't like. And suddenly the messenger was on the ground, shoulder pressed into dirt, arms bound behind him with rope that smelled of mold. They didn't always beat him, not unless someone had lost a son that year, or if the harvest had been too poor to feed the manor. Then fists came fast, and boots faster. But more often, they just locked him away, in a shed or a cellar, or once in a pigsty. Always without explanation, always with muttered threats. "Stay quiet," they said. "Wait till the elder gets back." He did. He always did. Sometimes it took a night, sometimes two, and sometimes they forgot he was there entirely, until a child came to toss slop and shrieked at the sight of him. By then the parchment was damp, the seal close to failing, and his throat dry enough to split. They let him go. Always eventually, with warnings, with curses, with no apology. And he staggered back to the road, letter still intact, hands shaking. That was the cost of being a stranger. That was the price of carrying secrets without a name. Even when they didn't stop him, the fear was there. In the silence that followed his steps. In the doors that closed a little too firmly. In the dogs that barked but weren't called back. He learned to walk quickly, to meet no eyes, to speak softly and only when asked. Sometimes he wrapped the satchel in rags, made it look like a bundle of herbs or tools. But it didn't matter. People always sensed it. The weight of something unknown. And in a world where knowledge was rare and trust even rarer, unknown things were dangerous. A man with a letter could be 100 things, but never harmless, never welcome, never safe. So he moved on, past the hedges and wells and staring eyes, hoping that the next village would be different. It never was. They didn't ask questions. They didn't shout commands or demand to see the letter. They stepped out from behind the trees without a word. 3 of them, maybe 4, faces half covered in rags soaked with sweat and smoke. One held a club, another a knife dull enough to tear. They didn't want explanations. They didn't care where the messenger came from or where he was going. They knew what the pouch at his side meant. It meant coin, or a writ worth coin, or something sealed that someone would pay to see, or pay to keep secret. That was all that mattered. They didn't search him first. They struck. The first blow took him behind the ear, dropping him to the dirt before he could speak. The rest followed, sharp, fast, practiced. Not out of rage, out of experience. They had done this before, many times. He came to with a mouth full of leaves and blood, one eye crusted shut, the other staring sideways into a rut of boot tracks. The pouch was gone. The satchel, too. Even his boots had been taken. Laces sliced through, soles peeled from his feet. They left the clothes, mostly, but only because they were damp and torn. He rolled over slowly, groaning without meaning to, pain blooming from ribs to spine. He checked his side. No knife wound. That was something, but his hand shook when he moved it, and his lip had split so wide he could feel the air against his gums. They hadn't spoken once. That was what he remembered most. The quiet, like they were laborers finishing a job. Not a robbery, a process. Messengers were easy prey. They traveled alone. They carried things that weren't theirs but were valuable. They were too poor to bribe and too unknown to be missed. Bandits didn't care if the letter bore a king's seal or a bishop's hand. They cared about what it might fetch. Sometimes it was gold, sometimes a name, sometimes a reason to blackmail a steward or frame a rival. But the messenger? He was never part of the deal. He was just the legs beneath the cargo. If he lived, fine. If not, the next one would take the same road with the same risk. Some men carried 2 messages, the real one tucked into their boot and a decoy in their bag. But that only worked if the bandits stopped to look. Most didn't. They weren't collectors. They were scavengers. They took everything first. Sorted later. There were stretches of road known for it, places where the trees bent low and the air held still even at noon. Messengers whispered about them, but had no choice but to pass through. Guards rarely patrolled there. Too remote, too empty. Too many places to disappear. He had once tried taking a longer route to avoid a known ambush trail. 3 extra days on foot, crossing 2 swollen rivers and a field full of burrs. When he arrived, late and limping, he was fined for delay. No one asked why. No one cared. And so the next time, he took the faster road. He was lucky that time. Only a warning. Only voices in the trees and a shadow that didn't follow. But luck was another thing that didn't last long on the road. And no letter was worth enough to protect the man who carried it. Only the words inside ever mattered, not the hands that bled to keep them moving. The signpost still bore the old crest, a faded boar painted in red, its tusks chipped from rain and time. Beneath it, the stones of the road changed color slightly, darker from newer soil or different hands maintaining it. The messenger had passed here before, twice, maybe 3 times. He remembered the inn just beyond the bend, the narrow bridge with the missing plank, the shrines on either side where travelers left offerings. But something felt different this time. The flags at the gate tower were blue, not green. The guards wore chainmail with an unfamiliar sigil stitched over their cloaks, a crow instead of a boar. And the man with the halberd didn't smile. He asked where the letter was going, and to whom. The messenger gave the same answer he'd given for 2 years. The steward of Lord Renaud. The guard raised his eyebrows. You mean the steward of Lord Felix? He corrected. Renaud's lands were reclaimed last week. Didn't anyone tell you? No. No one ever told messengers anything. They were expected to know, to sense the air changing and to adjust accordingly. But borders didn't move with trumpets and scrolls. They shifted with raids, marriages, bribes, and blade points. A village could belong to one baron on Monday and another by Friday. Sometimes the new owner was friendly, willing to honor the old paths. Sometimes they weren't. Letters bearing the wrong seal were treated as insults, or worse, as lies. Once, in the south, a messenger was imprisoned for 3 days, simply for carrying correspondence addressed to a countess who had been exiled the week before. No one warned him. He had walked 20 leagues with that paper tucked inside his belt, thinking he was doing his job. They said he was part of a plot, that he'd helped her stay in contact with enemies. He didn't even know her name. The problem wasn't just who ruled, but who claimed to rule. There were lords who held the land by sword, others by ink, and still others by habit. Some had no claim at all, but they collected taxes anyway and demanded letters be addressed in their name. One valley had 3 such men, each watching the roads, each flying their banner at opposite ends. The messenger had learned to fold the outer wrapper of his letters so that only the destination was visible, not the name of the sender. But even that could be risky. If the recipient was on the wrong side of a new line, the whole mission became treason. And there was no time to rewrap or rewrite, no time to flee. Once a guard stopped him, the contents of the message belonged to their world, their fears, their laws. And those laws changed as quickly as a wind blowing a flag in another direction. Sometimes the road itself disappeared. Burned bridges, collapsed trails. Towns razed in the night for supporting the wrong heir. He would arrive at a place where he once shared bread, only to find a row of blackened stakes and a field where the grass hadn't yet grown back. And still, he had to try. Still, the seal on the letter hadn't changed, even if the world around it had. The message was a ghost now, meant for someone who no longer ruled or no longer lived. But he couldn't throw it away. That was never allowed. So he walked farther, to the next settlement, to ask where the line had moved. And if they told him the truth, and if they let him go, he would deliver the letter as close as he could. And if they didn't, well, there were worse things than getting lost. Like being found with the wrong name in your hands, and no lord left to defend it. The fever didn't start suddenly. It came in layers, like cold sweat rising through damp cloth, until even breathing felt too warm. His joints ached first, then his back, then the space behind his eyes pulsed every time he turned his head. But the road didn't care. The message had to be delivered, no matter how soaked his collar grew, or how many times he had to stop and brace himself against a tree. He wiped his forehead with the inside of his sleeve and felt the heat of his own skin through the fabric. His legs moved like they didn't belong to him anymore, not with rhythm, but with obligation. There were no inns on this part of the road, no fires waiting, no hands to check his brow or bring him broth. There was just the satchel, the seal, and the understanding that getting sick was not a reason to stop. Not for a messenger, not ever. When the stomach cramps began, he knew what came next. He'd felt it before, the twisting that turned into sweat, the sweat that turned into shivers, the shivers that turned into weakness so deep it made him afraid to blink too long. Diarrhea followed without mercy, sudden and humiliating, forcing him off the road more than once just to kneel in the dirt, gripping a tree root to stay upright. There was nothing left in him to lose, and yet it kept coming. He had no cloth to clean himself, no water to rinse, so he walked on, soiled, humiliated, reeking of his own failure. Still, the letter remained untouched, the seal unbroken, and the name on the front, whoever it was, remained more important than the man whose body was unraveling around it. His throat closed by the second day. Talking hurt. Swallowing hurt. Breathing hurt. The glands along his neck bulged like stones, and a bitter taste coated the back of his mouth. Every exhale whistled slightly. He tried not to cough. Coughing made his ribs seize. At one village he asked for water, and was given a ladle with suspicion. No one invited him in. No one offered broth or even a crust of bread. He looked too pale, they said, too slow. He thanked them anyway, voice barely above a whisper, and kept walking. The cold air only made it worse. The congestion sank into his chest and stayed there, thick and unmoving. He knew what happened next. He'd seen it in others. The red phlegm, the blood on the lips, the shaking hands. But stopping wasn't an option. No matter what he was carrying inside his lungs, the parchment in his bag still mattered more. Some died on the road. That was known. Collapsed in the grass, still clutching the strap of the satchel, bodies curled in fever and silence. If they were found, sometimes the letter reached its destination anyway, passed along by someone else. If not, the words were lost with the man who bore them. He'd passed one once, a body slumped beside a fallen pack, lips blackened, eyes sunken, flies thick on the wound that split one leg open. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't dared. Illness lingered like fog, and no one wanted to be near it, least of all those who already felt the weight of their own sickness blooming behind the ribs. So he kept moving, counting steps instead of days, tasting metal each time he coughed, watching the world tilt slightly to the left. His body was failing, but he walked anyway, because the message had not yet arrived. And that, in the end, was the only part of him that mattered. The parchment was folded carefully, wrapped in thin linen, sealed with a ring pressed too hard into the wax. It had the smell of ink and tallow, the faint weight of something recent, important, and urgent. But like all messages before it, it meant nothing to the one carrying it. The letters on the page may as well have been bird scratches on bark, elegant, deliberate, but unknowable. Most messengers couldn't read. There was no need. They were not the authors, nor the recipients. They were the legs, the pack horse, the bearer of hands and distance. What they delivered might have been news of peace, or a plea for mercy, or a list of names to be executed by sunrise. But they would never know. They walked blindly into consequences shaped by sentences they couldn't understand, and sometimes the message killed them before it even arrived. There had been a village once, tucked behind a dry hill where the trees grew close and the air smelled of rosemary. He had been there before, twice. The people remembered him. The last time they offered him goat milk and let him sleep in the hayloft. But when he returned a month later, carrying a letter bound in red thread, he found the gates barred. Smoke rose in thin trails from behind the wall, and no children played along the road. He called out, once, then again. A face appeared over the palisade, pale, shaking, covered in cloth. They didn't speak. They just stared. Then someone shouted from behind them, and the face vanished. A rock flew over the wall, then another. He stepped back. He didn't know what was in the letter. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was the cause. Either way, he turned and walked away, slower than before. Later, he learned, from another messenger 3 towns east, that the village had been hit by plague. The red thread meant quarantine. The message had been a notice of containment, sent too late. By the time he reached them, they already knew. But he hadn't. He'd touched the gate, sat on the earth near their well, slept that night beneath a tree with a fever rising in his spine. For 2 days he thought he might die. He didn't. But it wasn't the only time. Messages often carried more than words. They carried blame, fear, orders. Some messengers walked into towns holding letters that named them enemies. Others delivered verdicts without knowing it. Once he arrived at a manor just before dawn. The guard at the gate took one look at the seal and stiffened. "Wait here," he said. The messenger did. A few minutes later, soldiers came. The man who received the letter was dragged from bed, screaming. That night, the messenger was told never to return. "Don't come back here again," the steward warned. "Next time, it won't be him we hang." There were letters about assassinations, about marriages ending and lands being seized, about rebellion, about surrender. Any one of them could make the man holding it a target. He remembered another story, passed around fires like a warning. A young messenger sent to a border town with an innocuous-looking scroll. He never came back. Word reached later. The message contained proof of a noble's betrayal. The town had already changed hands, and the new ruler wasn't fond of reminders. The boy had delivered the letter, bowed as always, and was killed before the seal even cooled in the steward's hand. Not because of who he was, not because of what he'd done, but because the words he carried threatened someone else's name. He hadn't read them. He never could. But he died for them just the same. That was the way of it. You didn't need to understand the blade to feel it go in, and you didn't need to read the message to be undone by what it said. The agreement was always the same. Payment on arrival. A few coins from the steward's purse, maybe a crust of bread if the manor cook had pity. Nothing up front, nothing guaranteed. The sender offered words. "They'll take care of you," or "Tell them I sent you," as if a name whispered on the wind could mend boots or fill a stomach. Messengers learned early not to argue. If they pushed too hard, they were replaced. There was always another man willing to walk for less. And so, they nodded, took the sealed letter, and began moving. Through sleet, through fever, through roads that chewed at their feet. They carried more than parchment. They carried debt. Because every step forward was a gamble. The further they went, the more they had to believe that someone on the other end still remembered to leave something aside for the one who brought the message. But memory was a fickle thing, especially among those with titles and rings. Sometimes, when the messenger arrived, late, bruised, limping, the steward looked at him as if he'd grown from the dirt. "Who are you?" they'd ask. "And who told you there was coin waiting?" Even when the message was delivered in perfect condition, even when the seal gleamed unbroken and the name matched exactly, the promise often withered. "We didn't ask for this," they'd say. "You'll have to take it up with your master." Only it wasn't his master. It was the one who sent him. And that man was now 3 counties away, unreachable, shielded behind gates and guards who didn't remember faces, only crests. If the messenger argued, the guards came closer. If he begged, the doors closed. So he left, empty-handed. Again. Sometimes they offered less than promised, a single coin instead of 5, a half loaf of hard bread, a frayed glove instead of shelter. The messenger took it anyway. Not out of gratitude, but necessity. You couldn't eat dignity. You couldn't trade pride for a dry blanket. There were places where even that was denied, where the recipient of the letter gave nothing and sent him away before nightfall. One man, a merchant with fine shoes and a gold clasp, once told him, "If you wanted to be paid, you should have asked before walking." As if the messenger had chosen this route, this hunger, this weight, as if asking ever changed anything. So he kept walking, colder now, and tighter around the mouth, with less to carry and more to endure. The worst part was that the promises were always spoken with warmth. No one ever said it cruelly. They smiled, placed a hand on the shoulder, called the messenger "good lad" or "faithful man." The words came easily, like water from a full bucket, and for a while he believed them. Not because he was naive, but because he had to. Belief was the only thing that moved tired legs. That and the dream of a warm hearth, a heavy pouch, maybe even rest. But the road stripped belief with every mile. Promises wore thin in the cold. They cracked in the sun. And when he handed over the letter, hands raw, body hollow, and the steward nodded without reaching for coin, that was when he remembered. Payment on arrival. Yes, but no one ever said what it would be, or if it would come from a living hand or a cold one, or at all. The cold didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, first as wind along the collarbone, then as dampness at the cuffs, then as a steady ache in the knees that no walking could shake. The cloak, once heavy with rain, stiffened as the temperature dropped, forming ridges of frozen wool that scraped the skin when he moved. Snow gathered in the folds of his hood and melted down the back of his neck, only to freeze again against his spine. His boots had been soaked since morning, and each step churned the icy water inside them like slush in a wooden bowl. He tried wringing out the woolen socks once, behind a fallen tree, but his fingers had gone too stiff to grip properly. By midday, he stopped trying. The cold had already settled in, not just on his skin, but beneath it, in the marrow, in the places he couldn't touch or warm. No fire in the world could reach that kind of cold. The joints were the first to fail, not suddenly, but with small refusals. His thumbs no longer curled as tightly around the leather strap. His knees buckled when he tried to squat beside a stream. When he rose again, his spine made a sound like parchment tearing. The pain wasn't sharp, not anymore. It was dull, pervasive, like being wrapped in stone. He moved slower, not from fatigue, but from caution. Every wrong step could twist something that wouldn't uncoil again. The letter he carried, still dry, still sealed, pressed lightly against his ribs, a reminder that he wasn't finished yet. And so he walked, bent slightly now, shoulders raised, not in defense, but in instinct. It didn't help. The wind found its way through every stitch, every seam, every space between breath and skin. At night, it was worse. There was no warmth left in the fabric. Even curled under a thicket, arms pulled tight across the chest, the cold reached inward. Sleep became something fractured, a few minutes at a time, followed by shivers that jerked him awake. He tried lying on his side, then his stomach, then his back, but each position found a new place to numb. He dreamed of warmth the way starving men dreamed of meat, vividly, cruelly. Once, in the early hours, he thought he saw a cottage light through the trees. He stood, stumbled toward it, only to find a patch of snow reflecting moonlight. That was the night his fingers stopped bending. He noticed it the next morning when he tried to retie the satchel and fumbled the knot twice before giving up. They didn't hurt, not exactly. They just felt far away. Eventually, even movement couldn't keep him warm. The walking slowed. The breath came heavier, and when the wind picked up again, slicing through the trees like a blade, he didn't curse or cry out. He simply lowered his head and kept going. Because the letter still had to arrive, and because stopping meant letting the cold win. He passed frozen streams, the water crusted in pale blue ice, and dead branches that cracked too easily under his weight. Birds no longer flew above. Even the animals had retreated. It was just him now. Him, the snow, and the message. The seal had held. But the man beneath the cloak was losing shape, like a figure carved in wax left too close to the window. There would be a fire waiting somewhere. There had to be. And maybe if he got there soon enough, the cold would leave the same way it came. Slowly, piece by piece, breath by breath. But for now, it stayed with him, curled inside his bones like something living, something that had no reason to leave. They never shouted at the parchment. They never cursed the seal. Their eyes always found the man holding it. The message might have come from the crown or from a bishop cloistered behind stone and silence, but when it arrived in the hands of a stranger with worn boots and hollow eyes, all that fury and grief found a target. When the new tax was announced, it wasn't the steward who was dragged into the mud. It was the messenger. When a marriage was denied, a title revoked, a levy doubled. The scroll wasn't torn apart in rage. The messenger's cloak was. His voice trembled as he tried to explain that he hadn't written a word, that he didn't even know what the message said. But it didn't matter. He was the face of bad news, the walking form of injustice, a target that could bleed and flinch and, most importantly, vanish. Once, in a southern village where the drought had lasted through spring, he delivered a sealed letter to the mayor's hands. It was short, only a few lines, but as the man read, his face drained of color. A moment later, he turned to the gathered crowd and announced that the tithe would increase by 1/3. There were murmurs at first, then shouts, then stones, not at the mayor who had read the words, but at the one who had brought them. The messenger tried to leave, but the alley was too narrow. A bucket hit his shoulder, a boot kicked his ribs. They called him a thief, a liar, a curse. He barely escaped. The satchel was torn. The letter, somehow, intact. He delivered it anyway. And when he arrived at the next gate, bleeding, they asked why he looked so ragged. He said nothing. There was no point. The same thing happened when death was announced. A lord fallen in battle, a noble heir found drowned. The messenger was the first to speak the words aloud, even if he didn't understand them, and the first to be blamed for them. Grief had no patience for logic. Mothers wailed and clutched at his arms, demanding to know why it had happened. Fathers clenched fists, looking for someone to punish. He was never prepared. There was no training for that. Just a scroll in his bag and a name on the tag. No one taught him what to say when the message shattered someone's life. No one told him what to do when they screamed. He stood there, silent, until the noise passed or the doors closed. Sometimes he was told to stay and wait. Other times he was told to leave before they found someone to blame in earnest. He always left. He always knew. He carried joy, too, sometimes. News of birth, a lowered tax, a marriage accepted. But those moments faded quickly, swallowed by the many more where he arrived to find a family on the edge, a town holding its breath, a guard captain with fingers twitching near his blade. And even then, the letter never hurt anyone on its own. It was only ink, only wax, only words. But words had weight, and when that weight crushed someone, it was the man who delivered it who stood closest. He had once heard a priest say that messengers were like shadows, never seen in full, never trusted, always blamed when the room went dark. And maybe that was true. Maybe that was the only reason he was still alive, because the darkness moved, and he moved with it, quietly, carefully, always carrying the next letter that would make someone cry, or rage, or bleed. Not because of him, but always at him. Not many women took to the road with a satchel across the chest and a sealed letter pressed against their ribs, but some did. They carried the same weight, walked the same rutted trails, slept beneath the same torn skies. But what they bore in silence wasn't limited to the parchment. Guards didn't just search their bags, they searched them. Rough hands at the waist, fingers curling under cloaks, demands to prove they weren't hiding anything against the skin. The seal might remain unbroken, but their dignity never did. No one asked a male messenger to remove his shoes, lift his tunic, turn around slowly in front of strangers. For women, it was expected. Part of the road, part of the role. And if they protested, they were told to go home, as if home would take them back, as if it had ever been a real place to begin with. They were watched differently, too, not just as messengers, but as bodies moving alone. Every village became a test, every tavern a gamble. If she walked in with a hood drawn low and asked for water, the room quieted, not with respect, but calculation. What's in the pouch? Who's she working for? Who she belonged to? If she answered too quickly, she was called sharp-tongued. If she said nothing, she was called a spy. Either way, she was called. Men leaned in too close. Women whispered behind curtains. Children stared. The weight of being strange and being a woman settled deeper than the letter she carried. And still, she walked. She adjusted her cloak, folded her hands, and stepped lightly where others stomped. Because the message mattered, and because there was no other way to be heard. Sometimes the humiliation wasn't loud. Sometimes it came as favors disguised as kindness. A stable boy who offered to brush the mule in exchange for just a smile. A guard who said the letter could wait if she sat by the fire a little longer. A steward who claimed he'd lost the coin meant for her pay, but might find it if she stayed the night. They didn't say the word. They never had to. The suggestion hung in the air, sour and familiar. She learned how to bend without breaking, how to say just enough, how to leave without running. But there were nights when none of it worked, when the room turned hostile and the door stayed shut behind her, when she wrapped herself tighter in her cloak, held the letter close, and prayed for morning to come before anyone else did. Yet they carried on. Not for glory, there was none. Not for coin, there was little. But because the road didn't belong only to men, even if it punished women more. They passed through war camps and monasteries, through frost-covered woods and parched fields. They walked through blood and silence and laughter that wasn't theirs. And still they delivered. Still they arrived. Sometimes with bruises, sometimes with shame. Always with the letter intact. No one remembered their names. Only the seal. Only the wax. But they remembered everything. Every stare, every touch, every word not said but meant. And they kept walking anyway, because the message had to move, and no one else was moving it. They barked long before they were seen, rough guttural bursts that came from behind crooked fences or half-broken gates. Some ran the length of chains that scraped the dirt raw, throwing their weight forward with every step. Others needed no chain at all. They stood loose in the yards of manors, or crept between the huts of small villages, eyes bright and low to the ground. For most travelers, dogs were just noise. For messengers, they were another kind of threat. Fast, territorial, trained to react first and question nothing. A guard might ask for a seal, a steward might request a name. But a dog lunged. A dog tore cloth before speech. They didn't care about the message. They smelled stranger sweat, road, and they bit into it with certainty. Once the messenger had tried to deliver a scroll to a scribe housed near a rural chapel. He stepped off the road towards the gate, raised a hand in greeting, and heard the crunch of paws on gravel. The dog came from nowhere, a blur of fur and teeth, and by the time he registered it, his arm was already bleeding. The bite wasn't deep, but it was fast and deliberate. The dog stood its ground afterward, watching with a low growl. The people inside didn't come out. No one called it back. He had to retreat, step by slow step, until the gate was behind him again. Blood ran down into his glove. The letter, miraculously, was unharmed. He wrapped his arm, delivered the message 2 days late, and was docked half his pay. They said he should have moved faster. It wasn't always the big dogs that did the most damage. The smaller ones had sharper teeth, faster tempers. They worked in pairs sometimes, one distracting, the other flanking. At manor houses, they often sat near the doors like ornaments, still as statues until the moment a boot touched the step. And then they snapped. Guards chuckled, thinking it harmless. Just doing his job, they'd say. But a torn calf or a chewed wrist could mean a week lost to infection, a fever on the road, a message delayed or dropped. The worst were the silent ones. The mutts bred from no line, belonging to no one, scavenging near barns or sleeping beneath carts. They had nothing to lose, and they bit without hesitation. He once spent a night on top of a root cellar roof because one followed him for miles and wouldn't leave. It circled below, patient, waiting. In the morning, he threw half his bread to distract it and ran. There were no rules against it. A guard who struck a messenger might face inquiry. A steward who denied a bed might be shamed. But a dog had no master, or had one who simply shrugged. It's a beast, they said. It's nature. As if messengers were not part of nature. As if skin and blood weren't reason enough to care. Some tried to fight back. Carried sticks, stones, knives tucked in belts. But that only made them seem dangerous to people, too. Once, he kicked a dog away mid-bite and was nearly arrested for it. You attacked the manor's animal, they said. That's property. He wanted to shout, wanted to scream that his arm was the one being torn. But he said nothing, just unwrapped the message, held it out, and let them take it like always. Because the letter had to move, even when the body carrying it left part of itself behind in the teeth of something that didn't know how to read. The words weren't his. He didn't choose them. He didn't write them. But when he stepped into a great hall with the wrong phrasing sealed in his satchel, it didn't matter. A letter could be written in gold ink, carried in with a bow, handed over with trembling fingers, and still ignite blood. Nobles lived by titles and silence and wounds never fully healed. One insult buried in a phrase, one forgotten formality, one missing honorific. And suddenly 2 banners rose where there had been none. Castles that hadn't drawn swords in a decade sent for men. Fields emptied, roads closed. And the one who had brought the message was the first to feel the change. Faces stiffened, voices dropped. The air shifted like a room with poison spilled in the corners. They never told him outright. No one said, "This is treason." They just stopped offering bread. Guards stood closer than they needed to, and by morning, someone always came to ask if he had read the letter before it was handed over. He hadn't. He couldn't. But suspicion didn't need proof. A letter that insulted a lord might have been tampered with. That was what they whispered. A messenger might have swapped the seal, or inserted a different scroll, or just delivered it too late, on purpose. Every delay was interpreted as strategy. Every crease in the parchment looked like deceit. And every messenger no matter how weathered or silent, was seen as a potential weapon in someone else's game. Once, after delivering a letter from a western baron to a rival family, he had been locked in a storage room for 3 days. They said they needed to confirm the message's origin. When he was released, he found 2 of their riders preparing for battle. He left without being paid. He didn't ask why. The letter had been enough. The messages themselves were rarely long. That was part of the danger. Brevity meant less to soften a blow, a declaration of intent, a refusal of marriage, a shift in allegiance. Once a single word caused a campaign: withdraw. That was all the letter said. No date, no explanation, just a command. When the recipient read it, his face went pale, then red. He tore it in half and shouted for his captain. Within the week, 400 men were marching toward the border. The messenger never found out what had happened. He had already been sent back the way he came, with another message sealed tight and instructions not to stop anywhere along the road. He obeyed. He didn't ask. He didn't look back. But the fear stayed. Every message was a weight, not just of distance, but of consequence. You never knew if you were carrying the reason for 2 houses to fall upon each other. And if you were, even unknowingly, you had to survive it. Because those who lost didn't always go after the man who wrote the letter. That man was protected by land, gold, and 100 swords. But the messenger? He walked alone. He slept on dirt. He bled when beaten. He had no name worth remembering. So they found him. Not always, but often enough. At a crossroads, or a tavern, or just before dawn. And they made sure he understood what he had carried. Even if he hadn't understood it then. Even if he couldn't read the words that had split the valley in 2. Snow came fast that year, falling in thick, silent sheets that swallowed the road and erased every footprint behind him. What had been a narrow trail between villages turned into a flat, blinding white. No ruts, no hoofprints, no stones to guide by. The sky pressed low, colorless, without edge or break, and the wind dragged dry snow into every fold of cloth it could find. The messenger's cloak had frozen stiff before midday. His gloves cracked when he clenched his fists. He had tied the letter inside 2 layers of linen and kept it near his chest, under everything, where the warmth of his body might keep it from turning brittle. He couldn't feel his feet anymore. That was fine. Feeling meant pain. Numbness meant another few miles of motion. No one was waiting to excuse him. No one would understand a delay. The message had to arrive, even if he did so crawling. He chewed on dry bread so frozen it split the roof of his mouth. Water had to be broken out of the skin flask and held in the cheek until it thawed. His breath came out in shallow clouds that clung to his lashes and froze there, building until it felt like he was blinking through frost. When he stopped, he did it standing. Sitting meant sleep, and sleep meant death. He'd heard stories, messengers who curled beneath a tree for just an hour and never woke again. One had been found come spring with his fingers still wrapped around the strap of his satchel. The seal on the letter was intact. The man wasn't. So this one walked, through snow that reached his knees, through a sky that never changed, with a knife tucked into his belt, not for protection, but in case he needed to cut away a boot frozen to his own foot, or worse, to open flesh and drain frostbite before it spread. Sometimes he sang, not for joy, but rhythm, a way to count the minutes, to keep breath moving. The words didn't matter, just sound, just proof that he was still there. When the wind rose, he shouted into it, not out of anger, but to make sure his lungs were still strong. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the quiet, the absolute silence of a snow-choked world that didn't care whether he lived or vanished. The trees stood still. The animals had burrowed deep. Even the rivers had stopped their speaking. And he, a man with a message and no shelter, was the only moving thing in a frozen place that had no patience for soft bodies. At night, the cold deepened. It didn't drop. It tightened, like a noose. He found a hollow between two stones and crouched there, wrapping his arms around his legs, keeping the letter against his chest. He whispered prayers without thinking, old words from a childhood chapel, things about warmth and mercy and waking. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. His knife was in his hand, not for wolves, but in case his limbs stopped answering. Morning came without light, just less darkness. He stood slowly, joints locked, breath wheezing through his cracked lips. Another day of white, another day of pain. The message still had to arrive, and winter was never an excuse, only another obstacle, one that cared even less than the lords who sent the words and asked nothing about how they traveled. The mountain paths were narrow, rarely wider than a man's shoulders, and never level for more than 10 paces. One side dropped into fog. The other leaned into rock, sharp and crumbling from years of weather and neglect. The messenger kept his weight low and his eyes down, testing each step before committing to it. His pack shifted with every movement, and the letter inside pressed awkwardly against his ribs, always leaning the wrong way, always reminding him how easy it would be to fall. There were no rails, no ropes, only instinct, and the hope that the soil beneath his feet hadn't loosened since the last rain. Sometimes that hope wasn't enough. He'd seen places where the trail had simply vanished, crumbled off the slope like wet bread, leaving nothing but dust and roots hanging in the air. There were no detours, only decisions. Move forward and pray, or turn back and fail. Weather in the mountains didn't change. It turned. One moment clear, the next thick with mist, or worse, wind that sliced sideways, dragging grit into his mouth and eyes. The wind didn't howl, it screamed. It tore through every layer of wool and linen, finding seams, openings, cracks. He tried once to brace himself with a stick, only for it to snap beneath him and nearly send him over the edge. From then on, he used his hands, palms against stone, fingers dug into cracks. He moved like a crawling insect, not a man, gripping the slope as if it might rise and throw him off at any second. And sometimes it did. Rocks loosened underfoot. Scree gave way. He slipped more than once, and once badly, tearing his leg open from knee to ankle on a buried shard of shale. He bound it quickly, hands shaking, blood already soaking through the wrap. The letter stayed dry. That was all that mattered. There were no villages here, no inns, no barns to shelter in, only sky and rock and time. The cold wasn't constant, but it was patient. It waited for nightfall, then moved in slow, through the fingertips, the ears, the lips. Sleep wasn't an option. If he stopped too long, his body would stiffen in place. He saw shapes sometimes in the distance, not wolves, not men. Shapes, leftover things. A boot, a strip of cloth. Once, a frozen hand pointing outward from a drift of gravel, its fingers grey and brittle like old wood. He didn't stop to look. He didn't pray. The mountain didn't care for prayers. It wasn't cruel, just indifferent. It didn't remember who passed over it, only who didn't. And even those were covered eventually, erased by stonefall or snow or time. He didn't count the hours. There was no point. The sun didn't rise so much as bleed through clouds. When he finally descended, feet slipping on moss-covered stone, breath burning in his chest, the valley below looked unreal. Too green, too soft. The letter was still sealed. His hands were blistered. His leg throbbed with each step. No one asked how he'd come through the pass. No one asked how long he'd been up there. They only asked, "Do you have the message?" He handed it over. No one looked at his wounds. No one offered a fire, just a nod, and the sound of boots walking away. The mountain was behind him now, But the ache stayed, deep in the bones, where the wind had left it, where the silence had set in, where the slope still waited, patient as ever, for the next foot to miss its place. The delivery was the end of the line, not just for the message, but for the man who carried it. The moment the seal passed from one hand to another, his presence became unnecessary, sometimes even inconvenient. He would bow, nod, step back, and wait for a gesture. Most of the time there wasn't one. No acknowledgement, no coin, no request to stay. He wasn't invited to sit or speak. The parchment was received, the door closed, and the purpose of his journey vanished with it. Whatever reply was needed, if there was a reply at all, would be written later, by someone else's hand, carried by someone else's legs. A new messenger, a different face. The cycle never completed itself. He was a one-way road, always moving forward, never returning to the place where his work had meant something for a breath of time. He wondered sometimes what the answers were. Did the request for more grain get accepted? Did the daughter's marriage go through? Did the plea for mercy ever reach the right ears, or get burned before being read? He had no way of knowing. No one told him. They spoke around him, to guards, to scribes, to servants, as if he were part of the stone or the floor. Even when he brought terrible news, or something obviously urgent, his role ended at the doorstep. A man in a cloak with dirty boots and no surname was not someone worth explaining things to. And so he left, always wondering what his words had done. Had they comforted or ruined? Had they solved anything? Or just deepened an already bitter wound? There was no continuity, no arc to follow. Each letter was a closed box he would never open, a line of fate that passed through his hands without leaving a mark. The faces he delivered to blurred together. Some looked hopeful. Some looked afraid. Some didn't bother hiding their disgust at his smell, his clothes, his silence. But he never saw those faces again. He was already gone before their reactions mattered. Once, after delivering a letter to a baroness whose husband had been killed in a skirmish, he had stood in the courtyard long enough to hear the scream that followed. But he was ushered out within seconds, told to wait by the road, told not to disturb. That was the end. He never knew what happened to her, whether she remarried, whether she avenged him, whether she forgave anyone. The message had been delivered. That was all. He sometimes imagined answers, rehearsed them in his head while walking, to pass the time. Yes, your request is granted. No, we will not come to your aid. He is dead. She says she cannot forgive you. The imaginary replies never carried emotion. They were flat, practical, lifeless, like the world he moved through. He had learned not to hope for warmth, even when a message arrived safely, ahead of time, with the seal perfect and the ink unblemished. No one praised him. No one said, "This helped." He might as well have been a shadow, a limb of the letter, a necessary silence that walked from manor to manor and vanished at the gate. He gave everything to the road, and the road gave nothing back. Not even closure. Not even a word. The letter was short and sealed properly. The wax still shone faintly in the candlelight when it was placed in the Lord's hand. The parchment was clean. The fold was neat. There were no signs of tampering, no smudged ink, no broken edge. The messenger had traveled 4 days to bring it, through frost and sleet, over a bridge half collapsed from last year's flood. His boots were torn at the toe, and the skin on his right heel had split open from rubbing too long against wet wool. But he stood straight in the hall, lowered his eyes, and waited. The Lord read the letter slowly. The silence stretched. His eyes narrowed as he reached the second line. Then he folded the parchment in half, very gently, and looked up. "Is this a joke?" he asked. It hadn't been. The letter, the messenger was later told, had come from a neighboring noble, one with whom relations were strained but still civil. It had been composed by a scribe, checked twice, and closed with every courtesy. But the phrasing had not pleased. A certain turn of phrase, a choice of words, a signature too proud. It sounded, the Lord said, like mockery dressed as formality. There was no need to ask whether the messenger had written the words. Of course he hadn't. But he had delivered them. He had carried them through the cold, handed them over without hesitation, watched them land like stones in a calm pool. And for that, he became the target of the ripples. A slap first, sharp, backhanded, not enough to knock him down, but enough to make the room go still. Then a shove, then a boot in the ribs. The guards didn't join in, they watched. The punishment wasn't about violence, it was about message. It wasn't the first time. Nobles lived and died by honor, by titles, by the invisible weight of language. A letter could be lined with silver and still offend if it struck the wrong chord. A greeting too cold, a sentence too bold, an omission that seemed deliberate. And when those things happened, when pride burned hotter than reason, someone had to pay for the insult. Not the sender. He was too far away, not the scribe. He had never left his bench. The messenger was present. Flesh and blood. Convenient. Beatable. Once, after a particularly tense exchange between two barons over grazing rights, a messenger was tied to a post and whipped not because the letter was false, but because the phrase, "with all due respect," had sounded like mockery. The messenger hadn't even read it, couldn't read it, but he screamed just the same. After that, messengers learned to brace themselves. Some tried to soften their expression when handing over letters. Others avoided eye contact entirely. A few even lied, pretending they didn't know who the letter was from, as if that might shield them from the full force of disappointment or rage. It rarely worked. Tone was a ghost, something felt, not proven. And lords feared ghosts more than blades. A message with the wrong tone could spread doubt, make allies question loyalty, unsettle servants. It had to be punished. And punishment had to be public, even if misplaced. So the messenger endured it, bled for it, carried the weight of other men's words in his bones and on his skin. And when he limped away, he still held the satchel closed, still listened for the next name, the next seal, the next hall where silence would follow his arrival like a shadow preparing to strike. The question always came eventually, sometimes before the letter was opened, sometimes after, sometimes from a steward trying to appear clever, sometimes from a lord who already suspected too much. "Do you know what this says?" It was asked gently at times, with a tilt of the head and a smile that didn't touch the eyes. Other times it was a bark, sharp and sudden, meant to catch the messenger off guard. The answer never changed. "No, my lord, I cannot read." It had to be said plainly, evenly, without fear or hesitation. Any flicker of emotion, too much calm, too much trembling, could be read as guilt. And guilt led to questions. And questions led to pain. A messenger's job was to carry the weight of secrets without ever knowing them. But not knowing didn't always protect you. Sometimes it made you more dangerous in their eyes. Because what if you did know, and were pretending not to? There were ways to test it. A scribe might be called to read the message aloud, line by line, while the messenger stood still, eyes fixed on the floor. If he flinched at the wrong moment, they would stop and ask again. "You sure you didn't read this?" If he breathed differently when a name was spoken, if he glanced sideways when a date was mentioned, that was enough. Once a messenger had been asked about a symbol on the outside of the letter, just a mark, a flourish of ink, and when he paused before answering, they broke his nose. Not for what he said, but for how long he took to say it. They didn't want knowledge, they wanted certainty. And in a world built on suspicion, certainty was a rare and dangerous thing. Lying was never an option. Not because messengers were too noble, but because they had no defense once caught. If a man confessed to reading a message, or even to guessing its meaning, he could be flogged, imprisoned, or worse, accused of conspiracy. If he denied it, and they still believed otherwise, the outcome was the same. One wrong word could make a messenger the center of a plot he didn't even understand. There were stories, always stories, of couriers who vanished between castles, dragged into basements, and questioned until their tongues turned purple and their minds split open. No trial, no record, just a name scrubbed from the road. Those stories were told in whispers, beside fires, by men who didn't sleep well afterward. They weren't meant to scare. They were meant to prepare. So a messenger learned to say it calmly, always, "I cannot read." And then he kept his mouth shut. No matter how many times they asked, no matter how many men stood around him with swords or ink-stained hands, he let them talk, let them accuse, let them search his bag and his boots and the folds of his cloak. And when they grew tired, when the questions slowed and the air cooled again, he bowed and left. With bruises sometimes, with cuts, but alive. That was what mattered. Because the truth was irrelevant. Only the fear of what he might know was real. And in that space between words and silence, between seals and eyes, a man could die, not for what he said, but for what someone else thought he might be thinking. Sleep wasn't something planned. It came only when the legs stopped answering and the eyes began to close without permission. There were no inns waiting at the end of the day, no warm cots by the fire, no hands offering broth and a blanket. The messenger slept where the road allowed, under trees when it didn't rain, in barns when someone took pity, in ditches when no one did. He had rested on hay wet with pig urine, on stone floors littered with chicken droppings, on frost-hardened earth that pulled the heat from his back until he couldn't feel his fingers. The body never truly relaxed. Even when unconscious, it curled against the cold, one hand always on the satchel, the other twitching in half-formed dreams of falling, running, forgetting the message. And when morning came, whether with sun or storm, there was no pause to stretch or shake off the night. He stood, stiff and aching, and began again. Sometimes he was allowed a stable, the far end where the light didn't reach, near the wall where the rats chewed holes through old sacks. He'd curl beside the rear haunches of a mule and try not to flinch when something skittered over his legs. The warmth helped. The smell didn't. Other nights were worse. Behind shuttered cottages where dogs barked at him until he moved on, he found low-hanging branches or half-buried roots and crawled beneath them. He'd use his cloak as a barrier between himself and the ground, but the damp always found its way in. Wind whistled across the fields, tugging at his knees and elbows like fingers trying to wake him. Once he woke to snow on his face. Another time to the sharp pain of a beetle inside his collar. But still he slept. He had to, because the next village was always another 8 miles, another hill, another chance to be turned away. He learned not to be choosy. A dry corner behind a mill was a gift. A pile of straw not already crawling with lice was a blessing. Once, an old woman let him lie beside her stove, muttering that she remembered what messengers used to be. Brave men. Important. She gave him bread, and he wept, not because he was touched, but because his mouth cracked when he smiled. But such moments were rare. Most nights ended in filth or hunger or both. He wrapped the message tight and slept with it against his chest, as much to protect it as to remind himself why he was out there, why he hadn't turned back, why he still moved forward, despite the blisters and the cold and the dreams that no longer felt like his own. There was never enough sleep. Even after the body collapsed, even after the mind blurred at the edges, there were still sounds that jerked him awake, footsteps, rustling, coughing that might mean sickness. He slept in slices, stitched together by fear and fatigue. And in the morning, He always woke before the sky changed, before the roosters, before the warmth. He stood slowly, pressed the crust from his clothes, stretched the stiffness from his fingers, and looked for the road again. Not because he wanted to, but because there was no choice. The message had to move. Whether or not the man carrying it could still feel his hands, or his feet, or the place where sleep had been before the cold took it away. They told him to wait by the hearth, not in the hall, not in the stables, not outside the gate. Inside, by the fire. The messenger stood in silence, cloak still dripping from the road, mud drying around the edge of his boots. He watched as the letter, sealed, bound, perfectly intact, was pulled from his hands and carried across the room with practiced grace. A steward broke the wax with a knife and unfolded the parchment before placing it on the table. A second man, younger, read it aloud in a flat voice. No one interrupted. When he finished, the room stayed quiet. Then the Lord gave a single nod. The steward picked up the letter, walked back to the fire, and without a word dropped it into the flames. The paper curled instantly, blackening into ash. No record. The Lord muttered. No trace. The messenger said nothing, but the words had been spoken aloud, and he had been standing right there. He hadn't meant to remember it. The lines were short, formal, too exact to forget. Something about troop movements, a shipment rerouted to avoid tolls, a name mentioned that shouldn't have been. He hadn't been trying to listen, but messengers learned early to hear without reacting. Information had a way of pressing itself into the mind, especially when spoken with such weight. By the time the ash was swept from the hearth, the message was already fixed in his skull. Every word, every name. It pulsed behind his eyes during the next 3 days of walking. He tried not to think about it, but the road gave too much silence, too much time. The memory nested deeper. Not because he wanted it, but because there was nowhere else for it to go, and that made him dangerous. Not in the way of spies or soldiers, but in the way of witnesses. He now carried knowledge that wasn't supposed to exist. No proof, no paper, just memory. That was worse. Paper could be burned. Men couldn't, not without leaving bodies. And so, from that moment on, his presence became a risk. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because someone else might worry he could. He kept walking, delivered the next letter, asked no questions, but the man who had ordered the parchment burned would remember, and the steward who watched him stand near the fire would remember. And someone, somewhere, might decide that remembering was the same as speaking. That silence could still be punished if the mind behind it held too much. From that day on, he stopped lingering in rooms. When messages were read aloud, he looked at the floor, fixed his gaze on a beam or the edge of his boot. But still he heard. He always heard. Not by choice, but because that was what the road taught. You moved through danger, you saw things no one admitted, and if you were clever, you kept it all folded tight inside you. Like a second letter, never sealed, never written, only carried, until the weight of it made your steps slower. Until one day someone looked at you too long and wondered what you might still remember, and what it would cost to make you forget. The message was sealed in violet wax, the kind used only by the higher houses. The emblem of the Duke was pressed deep into it, a falcon's claw wrapped around a crown. The note was short, tied tight, and handed over without explanation. "Deliver this to the bishop in Grendon," they said, quickly and with no detours. There was no mention of what had passed between them, though the servant said plenty once the door closed. Whispers of disputes over land, over men, over power and things that couldn't be forgiven. The messenger didn't ask. He nodded, took the satchel, and began the walk. But even before the first hill, he could feel it, the weight of walking in someone else's silence. The cold in the air that didn't come from winter, but from standing between two men who would rather see each other buried than greeted. The land between them was tense. Villages kept their doors bolted. Churches stood half empty, neither side wanting to appear loyal to the wrong power. Roads that once belonged to common traffic were now patrolled, watched from tree lines and tower windows. The messenger didn't wear colors. He had long ago stopped pinning badges or ties to his cloak. They made you too easy to mark. But even neutrality was suspicious now. If you didn't belong to someone, you were assumed to belong to everyone. And that was worse. Once, halfway through a valley, he was stopped by a pair of armed men. They didn't ask where he was going. They asked where he'd come from. When he gave the Duke's name, their posture shifted. One moved behind him. The other took the satchel. "Carrying threats?" they asked. "Or apologies?" He said he didn't know. They opened nothing. Just looked at the seal, then shoved the message back into his chest and told him to keep walking. He didn't breathe right again until sundown. The bishop's men weren't kinder. They let him through the gates, but not before a full search. Hands through his hair, through his cloak, his boots, his mouth. "You've come from poison," one of them muttered. "Best make sure you're clean." When he was finally let inside, he was kept waiting in a stone corridor for hours. No fire, no bread. Just the sound of steps echoing behind thick doors. He stood in place, back straight, too afraid to sit, too tired to lean. When the message was taken from him at last, no thanks was given. No coin. Only a glance, a sniff, and a dismissal. And when he turned to leave, he was told plainly, "If the Duke sends another, we'll not be so polite." He nodded once, said nothing, left before the words had finished ringing in the air. On the way back, he took a different route. Not safer, there was no such thing now, but quieter, less visible. His feet ached, his side still burned where the last guard had prodded too hard with a gauntlet. But he kept going, one step at a time, through a no-man's land shaped by pride and memory and bruises that didn't show. He had carried something between enemies. Not peace, not reconciliation, just more distance disguised as language. And he, the one who bore it, had become a threat just by existing. The road hadn't changed, but now it watched him differently, because now it knew what kind of blood he was willing to walk between, and how easy it would be one day to spill a little of his own. Some messages never touched parchment. They were spoken in candlelit rooms, whispered beside garden walls, muttered behind closed doors where ink was too dangerous. The messenger would stand silent while the words were spoken slowly, carefully, sometimes repeated twice, sometimes 3 times, until the sender was sure they had taken root. Say it exactly like that. They would insist. No more, no less. Sometimes they even made him repeat it back. And he did. Each word, each pause, as closely as memory allowed. Then he left. The message folded not in paper, but in his own breath, carried behind his eyes, beneath his tongue. There was no seal, no proof, only him. And if the words shifted even slightly along the road, if one phrase bled into another, if one name was mispronounced, it could change everything. He tried not to think too hard about what he was carrying. The best way to remember was not to understand. If the message made sense, it became heavier, personal, frightening. Better to repeat it silently like a prayer, detached from meaning. Still, it slipped sometimes. Hunger dulled the mind. Fatigue muddled syllables. He'd arrive and speak the message as practiced, only to see the listener's face darken. That's not what was promised, they might say. He didn't say that. The messenger would freeze, throat dry, and repeat the line again, slower. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it didn't. He'd seen hands go to sword hilts over a single misplaced title. Once a steward accused him of fabricating the entire thing. He was held for 2 nights without food until another messenger arrived with the same instructions, written this time. He was released without apology. Spoken messages were faster, yes. No ink, no drying, no seal. But they were also fragile. Air carried them, memory held them, and memory was unreliable. Some senders trusted too much. They'd speak names too dangerous, plans too large, thinking the messenger just a shadow. But shadows listen. And they remember, whether they want to or not. The most dangerous message he ever carried was only 12 words long. It named a meeting place, a date, and a warning. He spoke it to a man behind a red curtain who gave no sign of hearing. The next morning, the curtain was gone. So was the man, and the house where he'd waited was burned to the ground a week later. No one ever mentioned it. But the messenger remembered. Not just the words, the tone, the room, the way the sender's hand trembled slightly before speaking. There were no second chances, no copies to check, no records to point to. If the messenger failed, the message disappeared. If he changed it, the consequences were his. Sometimes the words were never meant to arrive. They were bait, a test, a trap to see who was loyal. He delivered those too, knowing full well that the man who received them might be executed before sunset. But he never questioned, never asked. His job was to carry breath, not judge it. And in a world where ink could be forged but memory could be blamed, there was no safer or more dangerous way to speak than through a man who had nothing but his voice to give. They already knew his name before he stepped into the village, or rather, the name they'd given him. Not the one he'd been born with, not the one he didn't bother saying anymore. Here, on this stretch of road where the trees leaned in too close and the air tasted like old smoke, he was no longer just a messenger. He was something else. A spy, a thief, a servant of powers they didn't understand but feared anyway. It started with whispers, the kind that clung to fences and doorways, passed from cracked lips to hungry ears. He brings bad omens, someone would say. Where he goes, men disappear, crops fail, horses fall sick. He hadn't even crossed the bridge yet, and already shutters were closing, dogs pulling taut against their chains, children gathered and rushed inside by thin arms. The message he carried could have been a wedding invitation. It didn't matter. His presence had become a story. And stories didn't ask for truth. Sometimes he wondered how it started. Was it a misread seal? A letter that brought bad news last year? A rumor that clung to him like dirt, passed from one frightened man to another, until he became a silhouette with 100 shadows? The wind carried things in these parts. Curses, suspicions, memories of war. Villages didn't need reasons to fear. They needed symbols, something to explain the drought, the fever, the stillborn calf. A man in a travel cloak, walking alone with no crops to trade, and a strange silence in his eyes. That was enough. They saw the satchel and imagined knives. They saw his boots and imagined footprints in places they'd sworn off. And when he spoke, his voice only confirmed what they had already decided, that he wasn't one of them, that he didn't belong. He once arrived in a town just after sunset and found a group of men waiting by the gate. No weapons drawn, just stares that didn't blink. One asked where he'd come from. He answered. Another asked what he carried. He said it was a private message. That was a mistake. The third man stepped forward and said they'd heard he carried plagues, that he had been seen speaking to soldiers from across the river, that someone's cousin had died the same day he passed through. The messenger tried to deny it, calmly, plainly. But they didn't want answers. They wanted confirmation. One man spat. Another reached for the strap on his satchel. He backed away slowly, hands raised, repeating he was only passing through. Only when a woman, older, firm-voiced, stepped between them and said he could stay the night in her shed did they let him go. In the morning, she was gone. Her house shuttered. He never knew what price she paid for giving him a roof. He learned over time to walk quieter, to avoid paths too close to villages after dusk, to sleep in ditches rather than knock on doors. He buried the satchel once beneath his cloak, hoping it would make him seem less official. It only made him look like he had something to hide. The truth followed slower than the story. The truth was always tired, wet, coughing, hungry. But the story, that moved fast. It rode ahead of him, crossing rivers before he did, planting roots in places he hadn't seen. And when he arrived, he was already a villain. Not because of what he'd done, but because fear needed someone to wear its shape. And a man who brought other people's words was as good a shape as any. They didn't watch the road when you were gone. They didn't mark the days on any wall. There were no candles burning in windows, no quiet prayers whispered for your safe return. You left with the letter and the seal, and you came back with mud in your mouth and a limp in your step, and no one said a word. The same chickens pecked at the same bare yard. The same smoke curled from the same chimney. The dog barked once, and that was more greeting than you got from anyone inside. It wasn't cruelty. It was something colder than that. Indifference shaped by repetition. You had left before. You had come back before. And you would leave again. That was the rhythm of your life, and it no longer moved anyone. You weren't missed. You were expected eventually, but not longed for. Your return was not an event. It was a disturbance. You pushed the door open with your shoulder because your hands were numb. The hinges squeaked the same way they always did. Someone looked up, briefly, from the hearth or the table, eyes dull and tired, then looked back down. No one asked if you'd eaten. No one offered to take the damp cloak or the satchel that had cut into your shoulder for 3 days straight. If you coughed, they flinched. If you limped, they rolled their eyes. If you spoke, they interrupted. They didn't want stories. They didn't want details. They wanted silence, warmth, routine. And you, sick, frostbitten, still stinking of the road, didn't belong in that quiet anymore. You had been gone too long, and in that time, the hearth had moved on without you. You tried not to take it personally. You told yourself it was just the way of things. People had their own burdens, their own wounds. Maybe they didn't ask because they were afraid of what you might say. Maybe they didn't listen because they knew the road had no good endings. But even lies would have helped. Even a half-hearted "did you make it in time?" or "did they treat you well?" would have meant something. Instead, you sat on a stool, unbuckling stiff boots, listening to your own breath rattle in your chest, and realizing no one had even noticed you'd left the week before. The letter was gone, the job was done, and your presence now only reminded them that you'd be leaving again. And when you did, they wouldn't say goodbye either. The worst part wasn't the silence or the cold food or the dry bed. It was how quickly you disappeared back into the background. You weren't the man who had crossed rivers or dodged soldiers or delivered news that changed someone's life. You were just another mouth, another shadow by the fire. When they spoke, they didn't include you. When they counted heads, they often forgot yours. You were a temporary thing, even in your own home. And in time, you started to forget, too, what it meant to be welcomed, to be needed, to be held in someone's thoughts while you were gone. The road was cruel, but it was honest. It didn't pretend to care. It just stretched forward, indifferent, endless. And maybe that's why you kept walking it. Because out there, at least you knew where you stood. There were no guilds for people like you, no banners stitched to your tunic, no oath spoken before a flame, no place where your name echoed in the hall. You didn't wear a crest. You weren't sworn to a house. You weren't trained in a school. You learned to walk by walking. You learned to endure by enduring. When you fell ill, you wrapped yourself in your own arms. When you bled, you pressed your own cloth to the wound. No physician waited at the next village. No brother-in-arms stood behind you. You belonged to no one. The road didn't claim you, but it never let you go. And the letter, crumpled, sealed, unread, was never yours, but always your burden. That was the rule. That was the shape of your life. One foot in front of the other, with no one asking your name and no one remembering your face. You met people, of course. Innkeepers who overcharged you for stale bread. Guards who made you empty your pouch, then kicked you just to see what you'd do. Farmers who gave you a bowl of soup and a place in the barn, but only after you swore on your life that the letter carried no plague. Sometimes someone would speak kindly to you, usually an old woman, or a child too small to understand what you were. But no one stayed long. No one traveled with you. Even the dogs gave up on your scent, as if you were already fading. You kept your own company, and sometimes you talked aloud just to hear a voice. Any voice, on the long stretches of mud and wind and silence. It didn't help. The silence always came back stronger. At night, your companions were frost, bruises, and the sound of your own breath. If you were lucky, you slept near a fire. If you were very lucky, you slept under a roof. But most nights it was just a hedgerow or a patch of moss beside the road. You didn't dream because you were too tired. Your mind shut down the moment your body dropped. But even in sleep, you were alone. No one kept watch while you rested. No one stirred the embers while you shivered. If someone came with a blade in the night, the only thing between you and the dark was your own hands. That was the cost. And when you woke, sore and cold and sore again, there was no one to ask if you slept well. Just the letter, the road, and the weight in your spine that felt older than you were. You told yourself that it mattered, that someone had to carry the words, that if you didn't walk, the world would be quieter, but not in a good way. You told yourself that every message kept something alive, a treaty, a wedding, a child's last wish. But even when it was true, it never came back to you. You never saw the joy or the sorrow. You never knew what the words meant. You just handed them over and turned around. Sometimes they didn't even take the letter from your hands. A servant did, or a clerk, or someone who looked past you as if you weren't even there. And that was the truth of it. You weren't. You were just the shape the letter took to move through the world. And when it arrived, you vanished. Always alone, always unseen, always walking. Thank you for staying with us tonight. History rarely speaks of messengers. They didn't leave monuments, they didn't write their own names, but every war, every peace, every crown, every crime moved through their hands. Quiet, cold, and anonymous. They walked between kings and killers, through storms and silence, carrying words they couldn't read, for people they'd never meet. Most of them didn't come back. The few who did came back forgotten. If you found tonight's story calming or eye-opening, we invite you to join us again. And if you're still awake, tell us, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Good night, and may your path be warmer, safer, and never walked alone.